They say blood is thicker than water, but after watching greed rot my family, I promise you nothing is thicker than the ink on an irrevocable trust. Have you ever watched an arrogant fool pop champagne in a $2.5 million mansion he does not realize he already lost? Pull up a chair. This is a story of a worthless contract, a massive shadow debt, and a dying grandfather who delivered the perfect checkmate. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep our operations running. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our dedicated team, helping them cover their living expenses and continue creating these videos for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on the donation page on your screen or by clicking the donation link found in the description or the comments section of this video. My name is Freya Vega. I am 32 years old, and I make my living hunting ghosts. Professionally speaking, I am a forensic fraud auditor at Aegis Horizon Analytics, a firm specializing in tracking dirty money across the globe. My job is to stare at spreadsheets, bank statements, and tax returns until the numbers confess their sins. I find the hidden offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, the phantom liabilities. Over the years, I have seen families tear each other apart over inheritance and business partners destroy decades of friendship for a slightly larger slice of a corporate pie. People lie constantly, but balance sheets do not. I have spent my entire career dissecting the anatomy of greed, which makes it particularly amusing that the most fascinating case of financial fraud I have ever witnessed was perpetrated right in my own backyard. The stage for this performance was a breathtaking mid-century modern coastal estate nestled in the cliffs of Marin County, California. It is a stunning piece of architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows and panoramic ocean views. Currently valued at roughly $2.5 million, the rightful owner of this masterpiece is my grandfather, Arthur. At 89 years old, Arthur is a retired aerospace engineer whose mind was once as sharp as the precision instruments he designed for commercial jets. Recently, however, he had begun to present a facade of severe cognitive decline and profound hearing loss. During family gatherings, he sat in his wheelchair, wrapped in a thick plaid blanket, staring blankly at the Pacific Ocean while his descendants hovered around him like vultures circling a wounded animal. In my family, the contrast between reality and illusion is incredibly stark. For years, I have been the silent, invisible engine keeping my grandfather's life running. I pay his medical bills, I calculate and submit his property taxes, and I schedule his in-home nursing care. I do this quietly, completely under the radar, not for praise or reward, but simply because I love the man. My father, Julian, and my older brother, Vance, operate on a completely different, purely transactional frequency. Julian is a flashy real estate developer who wears custom Italian suits and drives leased German sports cars, projecting an image of limitless, untouchable wealth. Behind the curtain, however, he is drowning in a suffocating ocean of commercial debt, constantly shuffling borrowed money between failing development projects. Vance is somehow worse. He is a cryptocurrency day trader who projects an aura of immense superiority, constantly speaking in confusing buzzwords about blockchain technology while actually gambling away his savings on volatile, unregulated exchanges. To Julian and Vance, Grandpa Arthur is not a human being who lived a rich, full life. He is merely an expiring, automated teller machine, a temporary biological obstacle standing between them and a $2.5 million payday. The catalyst for their ultimate downfall occurred on a warm Saturday afternoon during a lavish family barbecue. Julian had invited several of his superficial business associates, potential investors, and our extended relatives, deliberately creating a large audience for the theater he was about to produce. The smell of expensive grilled steaks and expensive cologne filled the salty ocean air. Suddenly, Julian stood at the head of the massive teak wood patio table and tapped a silver salad fork against his crystal wine glass, demanding the courtyard's attention. Can I have everyone's attention, please? Julian announced, his voice booming with unearned, arrogant authority. As you all know, Vance is getting married soon. As a father, I want to ensure my son starts his new life on a solid, unbreakable foundation. Given my father's unfortunate mental decline, I am utilizing my legal power of attorney to transfer the deed of this beautiful Marin County estate to Vance as an early wedding gift. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his designer jacket and pulled out a thick legal document, waving it in the air like a conquering general displaying a captured flag. The patio immediately erupted into applause. People cheered and clapped, raising their champagne glasses to toast Julian's incredible, selfless generosity and Vance's fabricated success. Vance puffed out his chest, wrapping an arm around his fiancée, soaking up the admiration while pretending to be profoundly humbled by the gesture. I shifted my gaze to the far corner of the patio. Grandpa Arthur was sitting alone in his wheelchair, completely ignored by the cheering crowd. He looked like a discarded prop in their grand production. Not a single person went over to thank him, to pat his shoulder, or to acknowledge that it was his house, bought with decades of his intense labor, being casually tossed around like a party favor. Anyone else in my position might have screamed. Another daughter might have flipped the table, cried out in betrayal, or caused a massive scene, demanding to know how her father could legally steal her grandfather's home right in front of everyone. I did none of those things. I felt no sudden rage. I shed absolutely no tears. Instead, I simply leaned back in my wooden chair, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and offered a polite, silent toast to the men celebrating their own brilliance. I smiled because I was the exact only person sitting in that sun-drenched courtyard who knew the absolute, undeniable truth. That piece of paper Julian was waving around with such intense, blinding pride was not a deed transfer. It was a worthless piece of garbage. And they had absolutely no idea. They had just signed their own financial death warrants. Exactly 8 months before that sunny, nauseating barbecue, the foundation of my father's delusion was carefully and quietly dismantled. The operation began on a freezing, rain-soaked Tuesday evening in late November. I had stopped by the estate to drop off some specialty groceries and organize Arthur's medications. When I walked in, the air in the house felt heavy. My father and brother had just left after staging a loud, aggressive, and entirely one-sided argument in the living room. They had spent an hour demanding that Grandpa Arthur sell a portion of the coastal land to fund a brand-new, highly speculative tech startup for Vance. Throughout their entire aggressive pitch, Arthur had simply sat in his leather recliner, his eyes glazed over, occasionally nodding at the blank wall, pretending he could not hear a single word they were screaming. But the exact moment the headlights of their leased sports cars vanished down the winding driveway, his entire posture transformed. The artificial trembling in his hands instantly disappeared. He straightened his back, looked directly at me with eyes as sharp and crystal clear as a freshly cut diamond, and broke his silence. I am not losing my mind. Freya, I am just entirely sick and tired of listening to those two parasites beg for my money. The severe dementia and the profound hearing loss had been a brilliant, highly calculated, theatrical defense mechanism. It was the only way an exhausted 89-year-old man could find a moment of peace in his own home. However, Arthur was a pragmatic engineer who dealt in facts, and he knew that playing deaf would not protect his hard-earned assets forever. He knew they were circling him. He needed empirical data, so he asked me to do exactly what I do best. That same night, I set up my encrypted work laptop at his rustic kitchen table. Bypassing my firm's standard servers to maintain absolute secrecy, I ran private, deep-level forensic financial background checks on my own flesh and blood. The digital paper trail I uncovered was a horrific financial tragedy. Julian was not just struggling to maintain his lavish lifestyle, he was standing on the absolute razor edge of a total, unrecoverable bankruptcy. He had heavily over-leveraged his real estate development company to acquire several massive commercial strip malls right before the retail market completely crashed. My father was millions of dollars in the red, consistently missing his monthly interest payments, and facing massive impending balloon loans that he possessed absolutely zero capacity to repay. Vance was in an even more pathetic and desperate situation. His highly broadcasted cryptocurrency wealth was nothing but a fragile mirage. I traced his digital wallets and discovered he had arrogantly poured every single cent of his savings, and some heavily borrowed margin funds, into an unregulated offshore digital exchange. That specific exchange had completely collapsed just 3 weeks prior, leaving my brother with a net worth of absolute zero. They were not merely greedy men looking for a bonus, they were drowning men, panicking, desperate, and looking for a heavy piece of wood to cling to. And desperate men do incredibly dangerous things. Armed with this terrifying, undeniable financial intelligence, my grandfather and I made our countermove. Under the heavy cover of darkness and a thick coastal fog, I drove Arthur across the Golden Gate Bridge to a highly discreet, unmarked high-rise office building in the financial district of San Francisco. We sat down in a soundproof glass conference room with one of the most ruthless, highly respected, and terrifyingly efficient estate attorneys on the entire West Coast. The lawyer listened to our findings and immediately drafted a completely bulletproof, aggressive defensive strategy. Step 1 was surgical, immediate, and completely lethal to my father's plans. Arthur formally and officially revoked the power of attorney he had mistakenly granted Julian 5 long years earlier. The revocation document was legally executed, notarized, and quietly filed with the county clerk, rendering my father's supposed legal authority entirely void and completely useless. Step 2 was building the impenetrable fortress. Arthur legally transferred the deed of the Marin County estate into a strict, ironclad, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is exactly what its name implies. Once it is signed, it cannot be altered, it cannot be broken, and most importantly, it creates a massive legal firewall that completely shields the property from any outside creditors, predatory family members, or fraudulent claims. I was named as the sole, undisputed beneficiary of this trust. By the time we walked out of that skyscraper and back into the cold night air, the house was already untouchable. But my grandfather was a man who spent his life designing redundant safety systems for military aircraft. He understood that a strong defense was only half of a winning equation. He wanted a devastating contingency plan, a way to neutralize the threat of Julian and Vance permanently. This is where the narrative shifts from a simple defensive legal maneuver to a predatory, calculated financial strike. Instead of just securing the house, Arthur took a massive chunk of his remaining liquid retirement savings and instructed our lawyer to establish a blind limited liability company. A blind LLC is a beautiful tool because it offers complete, impenetrable anonymity. On paper, it was just a faceless, generic corporate entity registered to a post office box in Delaware. In reality, it was a loaded weapon. Operating secretly through this shadow company, our attorney approached Julian's primary commercial lenders. Banks absolutely despise holding on to bad debt. They would rather sell a highly toxic, non-performing loan to a third party for pennies on the dollar than deal with a messy, drawn-out, and expensive public foreclosure process. Our anonymous shell company quietly purchased all of Julian's defaulted commercial mortgages at a massive discount. My arrogant father firmly believed he owed his crushing debt to a massive, faceless banking institution. He had absolutely no idea that his new, sole, unyielding creditor was his elderly father, and by direct extension, me. This was the invisible, ticking time bomb that had been perfectly set. When Julian proudly stood up at that barbecue and used a dead, revoked power of attorney to sign the house over to Vance, he committed an act that was entirely worthless from a legal standpoint. Yet, those two arrogant men were completely blind to the reality that they were dancing gleefully in a minefield, celebrating a victory in a war they had already catastrophically lost. Less than 48 hours after that sickening barbecue, the invasion officially began. Vance did not merely move into the pristine, historically significant estate. He occupied it like a tasteless, arrogant warlord determined to erase any trace of class. The property was a masterpiece of clean lines and natural light. But to my brother, it was simply an outdated canvas waiting for his profoundly awful aesthetic. He immediately hired a crew of cheap, unlicensed contractors who brought sledgehammers and a total disregard for architectural integrity. They began violently tearing down the elegant, custom-milled cedar wall panels that defined the living space. In their place, Vance installed aggressively bright, color-changing neon accent lighting and highly reflective, fake marble floors that made the main hall look exactly like the VIP lounge of a bankrupt, desperately tacky nightclub. The most disgusting offense, however, was his treatment of our grandfather. Under the pathetic, transparent guise of keeping Arthur safely away from the dangerous construction dust, Vance forcefully relocated the elderly man out of his own master bedroom. He shoved Arthur into the cramped, drafty, uninsulated guest house situated at the very back edge of the property, treating him like an unwanted piece of inherited furniture. 2 weeks into this architectural massacre, Julian decided it was the perfect time to capitalize on the grand illusion. He orchestrated a ridiculously lavish, wildly expensive housewarming party. He hired private valet drivers, a full-string quartet, and a high-end catering team that served caviar on silver platters. Julian invited dozens of his most aggressive commercial lenders, jittery business associates, and skeptical potential investors to flood the newly ruined living space. The entire event was a pathetic, carefully constructed smokescreen. Julian paraded through the crowd wearing a custom velvet dinner jacket, loudly boasting about his son's massive real estate acquisition and holding his head high. He desperately needed these men to believe that the Vega family was so incredibly flush with cash that they casually handed out coastal mansions as early wedding presents. He was using my grandfather's stolen home as a human shield, projecting an image of generational, untouchable wealth to distract his creditors from the absolute reality that his own commercial empire was rotting from the inside out. I attended this circus, deliberately blending into the background like a quiet, insignificant shadow. I stood near a hideous new faux gold pillar, sipping a glass of sparkling water, watching the absolute absurdity unfold. Eventually, Vance spotted me. He strutted over, holding a glass of overpriced whiskey, flanked by 2 of his equally insufferable, loud-mouthed friends. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "You know, Freya," Vance said, his voice booming so his audience could hear his benevolence. "I know your little 9-to-5 auditing job is incredibly boring and does not pay much. When my renovations are done, I can rent the basement out to you for cheap if you ever get unemployed." I did not flinch. I did not roll my eyes or grit my teeth. Instead, I let my shoulders drop, perfectly adopting the posture of a defeated, utterly exhausted corporate drone who had accepted her lowly place in the world. "Thank you, Vance. That is incredibly generous of you," I replied, forcing a weak, highly submissive smile that visibly fed his massive ego. As soon as he laughed and turned his back to brag to another group of guests, my demeanor instantly shifted. I pulled my smartphone from my purse. I did not take party selfies. I became a ghost, drifting silently through the hallways, meticulously photographing every single structural violation. I captured high-resolution images of the sledgehammer holes in the load-bearing walls. I documented the cheap, unpermitted electrical wiring hanging dangerously from the ceiling. I took pictures of the demolished custom cabinetry resting in a dumpster outside. Every single photograph I snapped was a beautiful, damning piece of legal ammunition. The real trust, the one safely locked away in a downtown legal vault, contained a highly specific, legally binding preservation clause that strictly prohibited any unauthorized architectural alterations to the estate. Every single time Vance swung a hammer, he was not building his luxury dream home. He was actively destroying his own legal standing and racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage liabilities. But the tacky renovations were merely the appetizer. The main course of his breathtaking stupidity was served exactly 3 days later. Vance's cryptocurrency addiction began demanding more fuel. His portfolio was bleeding, and he needed massive, immediate liquidity to chase his losses, operating under the absolute, blinding delusion that Julian's fake, revoked piece of paper made him the true legal owner of the estate. Vance took that worthless document to a shady, high-interest shadow lender. Traditional banks take weeks to underwrite a loan, demanding endless tax returns and verifiable income. Predatory credit institutions do not care about protocol. They saw a prime piece of California coastal real estate on the paperwork and gladly handed Vance a wire transfer for exactly $1 million, illegally using the house as collateral. Vance immediately dumped the entire $1 million into a newly launched, highly volatile digital token, absolutely convinced he was going to quadruple his money by the end of the month. He was completely oblivious to the fatal reality of his actions. You cannot legally mortgage a property you do not own. What my brother had just confidently committed was not a clever financial maneuver to save his empire. It was a textbook, undeniable, an easily provable case of federal mortgage fraud. Late that night, inside my quiet, meticulously organized apartment, I sat at my desk illuminated only by the sterile glow of my dual monitors. I printed out every single photograph of the demolished walls. I gathered the digital copies of the unpermitted contractor invoices, using the financial tracking methods I perfected at my firm. I pulled the undeniable proof of the $1 million wire transfer from the shadow lender to his digital wallet. I took a set of sharp silver pushpins and physically attached these documents to a massive corkboard on my office wall, physically connecting the dots of their catastrophic arrogance. Finally, I scanned the entire horrifying collection of evidence into a highly encrypted, password-protected digital folder. I typed out the title of the file with slow, deliberate keystrokes, The Downfall. The trap had been fully set. The poison had been entirely swallowed, and now, all I had to do was wait for the inevitable moment when the ground would simply vanish from beneath their feet. Grandpa Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep on a quiet Tuesday evening. His departure was exactly as he had wanted it to be, completely silent and entirely free from the exhausting, chaotic noise his son and grandson constantly generated. At the lavish funeral service held exactly 2 days later, Julian and Vance delivered an absolutely nauseating theatrical performance. Julian wore a custom-tailored Italian black suit and openly wept at the edge of the expensive mahogany casket, theatrically dabbing his completely dry eyes with a silk pocket square. Vance played the role of the profoundly traumatized grandson, leaning heavily on the shoulder of his fiancée for physical support, shaking his head as if the emotional loss was far too massive to bear. They accepted condolences from their wealthy friends with practiced, solemn nods, pretending to be broken men. However, their profound grief had an incredibly short expiration date. Exactly 14 hours after we lowered my grandfather into the earth, the mourning period abruptly ended. Vance's reckless financial gambling had caught up with him, and the shady shadow credit institution that had blindly handed him the $1 million needed the permanent mortgage finalized. They needed the paperwork processed through a legitimate, federally regulated financial institution to clear the title insurance and secure the loan. Early the very next morning, Julian and Vance confidently marched into the massive, towering glass headquarters of First Coastal Alliance Bank in downtown San Francisco. They fully expected to simply sign a few final mundane documents, shake a few hands, and walk away victorious. They sat in the plush leather chairs inside the senior credit director's office, sipping complimentary artisan coffee, completely unaware that a digital guillotine was about to drop. Down in the windowless basement of the bank, the underwriting department had been running a routine, deep-dive forensic analysis into the county property records. When you attempt to legally borrow $1 million against a piece of coastal real estate, the bank does not just take your word for it. The title search software hit a massive, unmovable brick wall. The historical chain of title showed a catastrophic, screaming irregularity. The automated computer systems instantly flagged the transaction as highly suspicious, immediately freezing the entire escrow process and locking the loan in a state of absolute administrative purgatory. Upstairs in the executive office, Julian was absolutely furious. In his arrogant, deeply flawed mind, this was nothing more than a minor clerical error made by some incompetent, low-level data entry clerk. He pulled out his expensive smartphone and aggressively dialed my number. I was sitting in my car, parked just 3 blocks away from the bank plaza, staring at the digital clock on my dashboard, having waited 8 long months for this exact phone call. When I answered the line, his voice was tight with impatient, bubbling rage. "Freya, get down to First Coastal Alliance Bank right this instant," Julian ordered, not even bothering to say a simple hello. "There is some completely stupid administrative holdup with your brother's property deed. Leave whatever pointless spreadsheets you are staring at and come down here to use your little women's paperwork skills to untangle this bureaucratic nonsense. I do not have the time or the patience to hold these idiot bankers by the hand all morning." I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, my face completely devoid of emotion, and simply replied, "I will be right there, Father." I certainly did not walk into that towering bank alone. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors flanked by our absolutely ruthless estate attorney, Mr. Sterling, and 2 massive, heavily armed private security contractors I had hired specifically for this morning. The highly polished marble floors of the bank lobby clicked sharply under my black leather heels as our extremely intimidating formation marched directly past the long teller lines. We moved with absolute purpose, heading straight toward the frosted glass walls of the senior credit director's corner office. When I pushed the heavy oak door open without knocking, Julian and Vance looked up from their leather chairs in total, absolute confusion. The arrogant smirks instantly vanished from their smug faces when they saw the 2 enormous security guards step inside and take up physical positions on either side of the closed door, essentially sealing the room. The senior credit director, a nervous, balding man in a sharp gray suit, stood up quickly from behind his massive desk, entirely unsure of what kind of hostile corporate takeover was happening in his office. I walked directly to the center of the room. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I calmly reached into my black leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, incredibly heavy stack of documents tightly bound by a solid navy blue legal cover. It was the fully notarized, legally flawless, and completely undeniable copy of the true irrevocable trust, placed right alongside the officially stamped revocation of Julian's power of attorney. I dropped the heavy stack of papers squarely onto the center of the director's pristine desk. The loud, heavy thud echoed sharply in the silent, suffocatingly tense room. "Director," I said, keeping my voice cold, calculated, and completely steady, "you need to halt this financial transaction immediately. The 2 individuals currently sitting in your office are attempting to finalize a massive loan using a highly fraudulent, legally void deed. The property located in Marin County was placed into a strict, ironclad, irrevocable trust exactly 8 months ago. I am the sole, undisputed legal beneficiary of that trust. Furthermore, the power of attorney Julian Vega used to execute his fake property transfer was legally revoked, signed, and voided by my grandfather long before Julian ever scribbled his name on that piece of garbage." Mr. Sterling took a slow step forward, looking down at my father and brother as if they were diseased insects scurrying across the floor. "Gentlemen," the attorney stated, his deep voice slicing through the thick, heavy air of the office like a perfectly sharpened razor blade, "your supposed property transfer is entirely void. The house belongs exclusively to Freya, because Vance Vega has already taken a $1 million cash advance against a property he absolutely does not legally own, using a deliberately fabricated chain of title to secure the funds. This bank is now legally obligated by federal law to flag this entire transaction." The bank director's face turned the color of wet ash. He looked wildly at his computer screen, then down at the ironclad trust documents on his desk, and finally at Vance. "Federal mortgage fraud," the director whispered out loud in sheer, unadulterated horror, slowly backing away from his own desk as if the paperwork itself was on fire. The atmosphere in the room violently and aggressively snapped. the devastating reality of the situation finally crashed down on the two arrogant men. Vance sat completely frozen in his chair, his jaw hanging open, all the blood rapidly draining from his face as the terrifying words "mortgage fraud" echoed endlessly in his ears. He suddenly realized he was no longer a wealthy crypto investor. He was a common criminal staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Julian, however, erupted into a blind, explosive, animalistic rage. He leaped aggressively out of his chair, his face burning a bright, unnatural crimson red. He slammed his heavy fists down so hard onto the director's oak desk that the artisan coffee cups rattled violently and spilled dark liquid across the wood. "You absolute treacherous snake!" Julian screamed at the top of his lungs, the thick veins bulging dangerously against the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "You maliciously manipulated a dying, totally confused old man. You tricked your own grandfather into signing this absolute garbage behind my back. I will hire the most vicious, most expensive litigation team in the entire state of California. I am going to drag you into federal court and expose you. I will sue you into absolute, inescapable poverty for elder abuse and manipulation." I just stood there, my posture completely perfect, completely unfazed by his screaming, staring back at him with absolutely zero pity in my eyes, silently waiting for the final act to begin. Julian did not waste a single precious moment retreating into the shadows after his grand delusion shattered. Instead, like a wounded animal backed into a corner, he chose aggression. Within exactly 72 hours, my personal mailbox was completely flooded with highly aggressive, legally hostile cease and desist letters. Julian and Vance had desperately pooled whatever pathetic remnants of credit they possessed to retain a notoriously vicious, high-priced corporate litigation firm. They officially sent formal threats to file a massive lawsuit in federal court, demanding an immediate, total freeze on all of the estate's assets. Furthermore, they had the absolute audacity to officially accuse me of severe elder abuse, illegal manipulation, and the outright theft of generational wealth. I did not cower, and I certainly did not panic. I simply instructed my own attorney to schedule an in-person formal settlement meeting. I agreed to convene exactly 1 week later inside a highly secure, high-altitude, soundproof glass conference room at their incredibly expensive legal headquarters. I arrived completely alone. I did not bring my lawyers, and I did not bring any security personnel. I walked into the lion's den carrying absolutely no visible emotion and only a single, heavily reinforced black leather briefcase. Julian and Vance sat across the massive, highly polished mahogany table, aggressively flanked by 3 incredibly expensive corporate sharks dressed in custom-tailored pinstripe suits. The lead attorney, a man who radiated sheer, unadulterated arrogance, immediately launched into a highly choreographed, incredibly loud, and deeply insulting monologue. He aggressively slammed his heavy hands onto the wooden table, barking out complex legal jargon, threatening to drag my professional name through the mud, to completely destroy my auditing career at Aegis Horizon Analytics, and to trap me in a brutal, decade-long legal battle that would ruthlessly drain every single cent I owned. He aggressively slid a thick document across the table, demanding I sign a full surrender of the Marin County property back to Julian immediately or face utter, catastrophic financial ruin. I allowed the man to shout for exactly 12 unbroken minutes. I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow, deep, and completely regulated, staring blankly at the aggressively expensive view of the city skyline outside the glass walls. When the lead lawyer finally ran out of breath and stopped to take a sip of sparkling water, the silence in the room became incredibly heavy, almost suffocating. Slowly, deliberately, and without breaking direct eye contact with my father, I unclasped the heavy brass locks on my briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a series of thick, aggressively highlighted financial dossiers. I calmly slid the first heavy, incredibly dense folder across the polished table directly toward Julian. "Father," I said, my voice completely devoid of any human warmth, perfectly flat, and chillingly precise. Your legal counsel seems to be operating under the catastrophic delusion that you possess any actual liquid capital to fund a prolonged legal war. Let us examine the actual, empirical mathematical reality of your situation. Julian glared at me, but his eyes darted down to the open folder. The arrogant color instantly vanished from his cheeks. He was staring directly at the exact internal loan numbers, the highly classified routing codes, and the official default notices of his massive, highly leveraged commercial retail developments. Exactly 8 months ago, I continued, my words slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. A faceless limited liability company registered to a post office box in Delaware quietly purchased all of your toxic, underperforming commercial mortgages from your primary lenders. You currently owe them roughly $14,500,000 in highly delinquent, deeply defaulted balloon payments. You arrogantly thought the bank was just being lenient with your constantly missed deadlines. You were entirely wrong. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the cold wood. I am the sole, executing managing director of that blind limited liability company. The capital used to purchase your failing debt came directly from the liquid assets grandfather entrusted to me. I own every single ounce of your debt. I am your biggest, most ruthless, and only creditor. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, you are officially in total, incurable default. I possess the absolute, unilateral legal right to instantly foreclose on every single piece of commercial real estate your company holds. I can legally seize your development firm, liquidate your assets, and leave you with absolutely nothing. Julian physically gasped, his hands violently shaking as he desperately tried to read the complex financial transfer documents. The highly aggressive, expensive lawyers sitting next to him completely froze. They instantly realized that their client was not a wealthy, wronged victim, but a hopelessly bankrupt, entirely hollow shell who could not even afford to pay their hourly billing rate. Before anyone in the room could formulate a single word, I calmly slid the second, equally heavy folder across the mahogany wood, pushing it directly under Vance's violently trembling hands. "And then we have your situation, Vance," I whispered, the intense coldness in my tone dropping the temperature of the entire room. Inside that specific folder is a complete, undeniable, forensic accounting of the deeply fraudulent mortgage application you submitted to that shadow lending institution. It contains high-resolution, time-stamped copies of the fake property transfer document you utilized. Most importantly, it contains undeniable digital proof that you deliberately forged grandfather's signature on a secondary collateral form. You intentionally and maliciously lied to a registered financial institution to secure a wire transfer of exactly $1 million, because those funds immediately crossed state lines into an offshore cryptocurrency wallet. You officially escalated this into a massive, undeniable federal crime. Vance began to openly hyperventilate. He looked wildly at his expensive lawyers, desperate for protection, but the 3 attorneys simply leaned back in their leather chairs, physically and silently distancing themselves from the radioactive, undeniable criminal sitting beside them. The federal sentencing guidelines for felony mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and the financial exploitation of an elderly citizen are incredibly severe. "Vance," I stated, locking my eyes entirely onto his terrified face, "the absolute minimum mandatory sentence is 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 10 long, completely miserable years. I have already drafted the official reporting package. It is addressed directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sitting on my desk, completely ready to be couriered." I slowly stood up from my leather chair and methodically buttoned my dark suit jacket. I looked down at the 2 men who had spent their entire lives treating my grandfather like an annoying, expiring obstacle and treating me like an invisible, worthless servant. Their grand illusions of supreme power, their deeply expensive suits, and their absolute, unyielding arrogance had been entirely vaporized by the sheer, devastating cruelty of raw, undeniable financial data. Sue me to claim the house, and I will push the button to send you both to prison or out on the streets. You have exactly 60 seconds to choose. The 60 seconds I gave them felt like an absolute eternity inside that cold, soundproof glass box. The suffocating weight of the financial and criminal evidence completely crushed whatever fight was left in their bodies. The highly paid, aggressively arrogant corporate lawyers simply packed up their briefcases and walked out of the room, completely abandoning a sinking ship, left entirely alone with the undeniable truth. Julian and Vance did not utter a single syllable of protest. Their hands shook violently as they reached across the polished mahogany table, picked up their pens, and signed the ironclad, legally binding non-contest agreements. With a few trembling strokes of ink, they permanently surrendered any and all claims to the estate, their massive egos completely and utterly shattered. The fallout was incredibly swift and entirely merciless. To avoid spending 10 years in a federal penitentiary for mortgage fraud, Vance was forced to immediately liquidate every single possession he had to his name. He frantically sold his imported cars, his flashy gold watches, and his custom wardrobe for a tiny fraction of their actual value, desperately scraping together the $1 million to repay the shadow lender. The former cryptocurrency genius now struggles to survive as a low-level, commission-only sales representative, cold-calling strangers for a meager paycheck, completely stripped of his arrogant facade. Julian faced a much colder, vastly more systematic destruction. Acting as his sole creditor, I executed my legal rights flawlessly. I legally foreclosed on every single piece of his highly leveraged commercial real estate, systematically dismantling and dissolving his entirely hollow empire. His corporate bank accounts were completely drained, his leased sports cars were repossessed by the dealerships, and he was abruptly evicted from his luxury penthouse. He was left with absolutely nothing. Finally experiencing the exact, terrifying sensation of homelessness and absolute vulnerability that he had so casually planned to inflict upon his own elderly father. With the legal war completely won, I officially took full physical possession of the coastal estate. I immediately hired a specialized architectural restoration crew to aggressively tear out every single piece of the tacky, profoundly tasteless renovations Vance had installed. We removed the cheap neon lights and the fake marble, meticulously restoring the original custom cedar woodwork and bringing the house back to its natural, peaceful, mid-century brilliance. A few weeks later, while quietly packing away my grandfather's belongings in his old master bedroom, I noticed a slight tear in the heavy paper backing of a small, framed landscape painting. Carefully sliding my fingers inside the narrow gap, I retrieved a folded, handwritten letter. The ink was slightly faded, but Arthur's precise engineering penmanship was entirely unmistakable. The short note simply read, "Your silence was always your sharpest weapon. Thank you for being the only one who truly listened." I walked out and stood on the wide wooden balcony, gently holding that small piece of paper against my chest. I watched the massive, rhythmic waves of the Pacific Ocean crash against the jagged cliffs below. The air was incredibly clean, entirely free of the toxic, exhausting noise that had plagued my family for decades. Using the remaining liquid funds from the Blind Limited Liability Company, I established a dedicated legal aid foundation. It is a specialized task force designed to aggressively protect vulnerable elderly citizens from financial predators and abusive relatives. The operation is highly successful, and it serves as a constant, daily reminder to the world of one undeniable fact. True. Absolute power never actually requires a loudspeaker. It only requires intense patience, a perfectly steady hand, and the heavy weight of undeniable proof. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are currently listening from, so please share your beautiful locations in the comments below. If you found today's narrative compelling and deeply satisfying, please consider supporting our channel with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the quick response code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct donation link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your direct contribution provides the vital budget needed to pay the dedicated staff behind these videos. allowing them to support their families and continue creating high-quality stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again for your incredible support.